The night was very quiet, the kind of peace that only Los Angeles could offer in its rare moments of silence. There were no loud sirens, no helicopters flying overhead, just the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the corner of the room. The soft creaking of the wooden floorboards echoed through Keanu Reeves's home on the hilltop. He was sitting in his study, a room filled with shelves full of old books, most of them worn and faded from years of use. A small, dim desk lamp provided a warm golden light that spread across the handwritten notes Keanu had left on his desk for an upcoming movie. He didn't notice it, but a cup of tea had been sitting beside him for a while, and it had gone cold. Tonight, Keanu wasn't focused on his work. For once, his mind wasn't on his career or the movie he was preparing for. Instead, he found himself remembering a scene from an old Akira Kurosawa movie, one where the hero didn't say anything, but his silence spoke louder than words. Keanu thought about how powerful silence could be and how sometimes it told a story better than speaking. His peaceful thinking was suddenly interrupted when his phone vibrated. The screen lit up, and Keanu saw that he had a call from an unknown number. The area code was from New Mexico. Keanu hesitated for a moment. It was nearly midnight, and calls from unknown numbers at this hour were never a good sign. Instinctively, his thumb hovered over the decline button, ready to end the call before it could even start. But there was something about the area code that made him feel uneasy. Without thinking much about it, he pressed the answer button. "Hello, this is Keanu," he said, his voice still tired from a long day. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then Keanu heard the soft rasp of someone breathing. It sounded like they were struggling to speak. Finally, a voice broke through the silence. It was faint and crackly like an old vinyl record playing. "Keanu, is that really you?" the voice asked, its tremor shaking through the line. Keanu straightened up in his chair, surprised by the voice. It sounded like someone he hadn't heard from in years. The voice was fragile and soft, yet it carried a warmth that made Keanu's heart tighten. It brought back memories he thought he had forgotten. "Yes, this is Keanu." "Who am I speaking to?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity and concern. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a deep, shaky sigh. Then the voice spoke again, its words coming out slowly as if they were trying to hold back tears. "My name is Isabella Mendoza. I took care of you when you were little in Toronto. Do you remember me?" The name hit Keanu like a punch to the chest. Memories he hadn't thought about in years flooded his mind all at once. He remembered the smell of freshly baked bread coming from the oven, the soft lullabies in Spanish, and the gentle touch of her hand as she placed a Band-Aid on his scraped knee. He could almost see her in his mind, in their little kitchen, humming as she ironed his school uniform. The sunlight would glint off her silver cross necklace as she worked. He could hear her whispering the soft word, "menino," when he couldn't sleep. The memories felt so real that it was like she was right there with him. "Isabella," he said softly, almost to himself. "Of course I remember you." On the other end of the line, Isabella let out a small, broken laugh, and Keanu could hear her trying not to cry. "I didn't think you would," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't call for anything. I just wanted to hear your voice one last time, before I can't anymore." Keanu's heart sank as he listened to her words. He glanced at the time and saw that it was nearly midnight in Los Angeles. That meant it was already 1 a.m. in New Mexico. Isabella was alone, not asking for help or a visit, but simply calling to say goodbye. It was clear that she didn't want anything from him, except the comfort of hearing his voice one more time. "Where are you?" Keanu asked, his voice now filled with worry. He stood up, already grabbing his keys. "I'm in Santa Rosa," Isabella answered softly. "At the Ridgeview home. It's not what it used to be." Keanu didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, even though no one could see him, and began canceling the next 3 days of his commitments. His assistant had texted him, asking why he was canceling, but Keanu only replied with a simple message, "Personal emergency. Postpone everything." He was already packing a small bag for the trip. As he threw a sweater into his bag and grabbed his passport, his mind spiraled through fragments of his childhood. He remembered everything Isabella had done for him when he was young. She wasn't just a caregiver to him. She had been his anchor, his safe place. She had been there when his father was absent and his mother worked long hours. Isabella taught him how to tie his shoes, kissed his forehead when he had nightmares, and held his hand when he asked questions about his father's absence. She had been there for him through everything. Now, at 87 years old, Isabella was calling him not for help, but to hear his voice one last time before it was too late. Keanu's heart broke as he packed his bag. He grabbed a book she had once read to him, Letters to a Young Poet, a book that had helped him when he was restless at night. It was a memory he hadn't forgotten. Keanu's assistant had texted him, worried about the sudden cancellations. But Keanu didn't explain. Instead, he simply replied, "Personal emergency. Postpone everything." He wasn't going to waste any more time. He had to go. Keanu called his pilot, informing him that they would be flying to Santa Rosa, New Mexico. The plane would be ready in 90 minutes. As Keanu made his way to the garage, he climbed into the black SUV that would take him to the airport. The quiet streets of Los Angeles passed by like a shadow. Keanu stared out the window, but instead of seeing the city skyline, his thoughts were focused on Isabella's face. He remembered how she had looked when he was a child, smiling, patient, kind. He remembered a particular night when he was 7 or 8 years old. He had been sick the night before a big school play. But he wasn't crying because he was sick. He was crying because he was disappointed that he wouldn't be able to perform. Isabella had sat beside his bed all night long, feeding him spoonfuls of chicken broth and gently stroking his hair. She had whispered to him, "Some stars shine later than others, mi amor, but they always shine." At the time, it had sounded like a story. Now, Keanu realized it was more than that. It was a lesson. When the plane took off, Keanu opened his journal and flipped to a blank page. He wasn't writing a speech or a plan. He was writing words. Words he might say to Isabella, words he never had the chance to say when he was younger. He wasn't sure what he would find in Santa Rosa, but he knew he had to be there before it was too late. As the plane flew through the dark night sky, Keanu thought about the strange irony of his life. He could travel across the world in a moment's notice, yet it had taken him 30 years to answer this one call. Sleep wouldn't come to him, so instead he replayed Isabella's voice in his mind. It was faint and shaky, but it was still warm, still familiar. She had never asked for anything, no help, no visit, not even comfort. She had only wanted to hear his voice again. That humility, that kindness was what broke him the most. She had given so much to him. And now, at the end of her life, she didn't expect anything in return. The plane began to descend. Just before dawn, the desert below was still cloaked in darkness. But there was a thin pink line on the horizon, the first sign of the sun rising. Keanu watched the sky change, the colors shifting like a promise that something better was coming. Santa Rosa was a small town, quiet and peaceful. The kind of place where time seemed to stretch rather than move forward. When Keanu landed, a nurse met him at the airport. She looked surprised to see who had stepped off the plane, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and led him to the care home. The building came into view, a flat-roof structure with cracked stucco walls and a flickering porch light. The sign said Sunset Haven, but it looked more like a forgotten place than a peaceful one. As Keanu stepped out of the car and looked at the building, his breath caught in his chest. What would he say to Isabella? How would she look? Was he too late? Inside the care home, the air smelled of bleach and reheated soup. The walls were lined with faded bulletin boards, decorated with curling paper flowers, someone's idea of spring. A tired receptionist blinked at Keanu when he entered, and he softly asked, "Isabella Mendoza?" Her eyes widened and recognition flashed across her face. "Room 12 East Wing," she said. "She's been up all night. She said someone important was coming." Room 12 East Wing. Every step Keanu took down the hallway felt heavier than the last. Old memories wrapped around him like thick fog. He remembered Isabella's hands making fresh tortillas, her laughter in the garden, her steady grip as he learned to ride a bike. He reached the door to room 12 and hesitated before knocking softly. "Isabella?" he whispered. A soft voice from inside answered, "Aye, Auntie." Keanu gently turned the handle and stepped into the room. The air inside smelled of old furniture and stale air. Isabella was sitting in a chair, looking frail and worn out. The room wasn't much, just a simple bed, a chair, and a table with a few flowers in a vase. It wasn't the kind of place Isabella deserved, but it was the place she had ended up. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes widened in surprise. Then tears filled her eyes. Keanu knelt beside her chair and whispered, "Isabella." She gasped and covered her mouth, unable to believe that he was really there. The tears came slowly at first, then faster, like rain after a long drought. Keanu reached for her hand, his touch gentle and careful, as though afraid she might break. "You came," she whispered, still not believing it. "I should have come sooner," Keanu said, his voice filled with regret. "I'm sorry." Isabella shook her head. "No, I didn't want you to come because of guilt. I only wanted to hear your voice one more time. To know you were okay. That was enough for me." Keanu didn't speak. He just leaned forward and rested his forehead against the back of her hand. That simple gesture said more than anything else could. Isabella looked at him again, really looked at him. He was older now, with a beard and lines around his eyes, but there was still the same quiet, gentle presence about him. He wasn't the same little boy she had cared for, but in many ways he was still the same. "I saw you on the news," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They say you're the kindest man in Hollywood." Keanu smiled faintly, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's because they haven't seen me when I'm hangry." Isabella chuckled softly, wiping away a tear. "You were always funny, even when you didn't talk much. You used to draw pictures of your dad with a banana mustache." Keanu laughed, remembering the drawings he had done when he was young. "Yeah, I put it in the fridge. My mom wasn't happy about it, but I didn't care." They laughed together, two old friends reconnecting after so many years. It wasn't the end that either of them had expected, but it was enough. Isabella smiled proudly at Keanu. "You needed to laugh," she said, her voice full of love and hope. But then her smile slowly faded. She looked up at the cracked ceiling above her. "You were always watching everything, even when you were a little boy. You saw things other kids didn't see. You felt things deeper too. I always worried the world would be too loud and too mean for you." Keanu looked around the room. It was small, with a dented dresser, a broken fan, and a thin blanket folded at the end of the bed. It wasn't a fancy place. Isabella shrugged, saying softly, "It's not much, but it's clean. The nurses try their best, but there aren't enough of them. There's no money. Most of us are just waiting now. When you get older, people forget you. You become invisible." Keanu didn't say anything at first. He just looked around the room again, his jaw tightening a little. He didn't like injustice. He never had. Isabella reached over to the side table and picked something up, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. She handed it to Keanu. "I kept this," she said. Keanu gently unwrapped the tissue. Inside was an old photo. It was a little faded and curled at the edges. In the picture, Keanu was about 9 years old, smiling sheepishly with paint on his cheeks. Behind him stood Isabella, smiling with her arms crossed proudly. "You kept this up all these years?" Keanu asked in surprise. Isabella nodded slowly. "I kept everything. You were my joy, Keanu. Even when things were hard, you gave me something to believe in." Keanu held the photo close to his chest for a moment. He felt a wave of emotion rush over him. "You believed in me before anyone else did," he said quietly. "I still do," Isabella said with a soft smile. "And I always will." Keanu placed the photo carefully on the table next to a glass of water that was empty. The room was quiet, except for the sound of an old air conditioning unit that hummed and coughed, trying to cool the room. Keanu stood up and walked to the window. He pulled back the curtain, letting in a little more light. Outside, the sun was shining over the desert, baking the parking lot. In the distance, a sagging fence leaned toward a dying tree. It looked so different from the sunny porch in Toronto, where Isabella used to bring him warm toast and hot tea while he read comic books. Keanu spoke up after a while. "I thought about you a lot, especially when things were hard. Your voice always came back to me." Isabella tilted her head, wondering what he meant. "What did I say?" she asked softly. "You told me I didn't have to be loud to be strong," Keanu said, still looking out the window. "You said kindness wasn't weakness and that even if no one noticed, it still mattered." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "You remembered all that?" she whispered, surprised. Keanu nodded. "I built my life on it." The room became quiet again, but not in an awkward way. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people share a deep, important bond. Keanu walked over to Isabella's chair and knelt beside it. "I'm not just here to visit," he said, his voice steady. "I came because you still matter. You always will." Isabella opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it. She couldn't say anything because the feelings in her heart made her throat tight. Keanu smiled gently. "I've already called my team. Tomorrow we're moving you to a better place, a private room with proper care and real dignity. And after that," he paused, making sure Isabella was looking at him, "you're coming home with me at least for a while. If you'll let me." Isabella's lips trembled. "But Keanu, why?" she asked, still confused. Keanu looked into her eyes and answered, "Because I never said thank you, not really. And because love remembers." Isabella started to cry again, but not from pain. It was from something deeper, relief, peace, and grace. She felt so much at once. Keanu sat beside her and gently held her hand. The warm sunlight from the window slowly moved across the floor, and no more words were needed. Outside, the wind kicked up dust across the cracked pavement. But inside that small room, time seemed to stop. Two hearts that had never truly drifted apart were reconnecting. There was a faded drawing on the wall above Isabella's bed. Keanu noticed it as he looked around the room again. It was a crayon picture he had made when he was just a little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. He had drawn himself as a knight, wearing a cardboard crown and holding a crooked sword. Beside him, Isabella stood, smiling proudly. The drawing was labeled Sir Keanu, Knight of Isabella. Keanu stepped closer to the wall and looked at the drawing carefully. He remembered that day. Isabella had read him a story about a brave knight who protected people, not with violence but with kindness. After hearing the story, Keanu had told her that he wanted to be that kind of knight. The next morning he had drawn the picture and given it to her. "I didn't think you'd still have it," Keanu said softly, almost to himself. Isabella smiled gently even though she looked tired. "How could I not keep it?" she whispered. "You were my knight. You still are." Keanu sat down in the plastic chair beside her, the one with the worn cushion. He reached out and gently held her hand. Her fingers were thin and cold, but they still had the quiet strength Keanu remembered from when he was a boy. Those same hands had once made him soup when he was sick and braided his hair when no one else had time. Isabella's voice grew a little stronger. "I saw the article about you a few years ago," she said. "The one about you riding the subway alone and giving up your seat." I smiled so wide, Keanu. "That's the boy I knew. You never changed." Keanu looked down, swallowing hard. "I've done okay," he said quietly, "but I've also missed a lot." Isabella chuckled softly, then coughed. "That's life. We miss things. But you remembered. That's what matters." After a long pause, Isabella added, "They told me I only had 6 months, maybe less. The treatments didn't work." I said no. It was too late. I just wanted one thing. Keanu leaned forward, his heart sinking. "What did you want?" he asked softly. "I wanted to see the man the boy became," Isabella said, her eyes filled with love and pride. Keanu's heart swelled. "You helped make me who I am," he said, gently pressing her hand to his cheek. "I wouldn't be here without you." Without another word, Keanu pulled the blanket up over her legs and adjusted the old fan so that it hit her face. Then he settled back into the hard chair, not moving. He wasn't going anywhere, not tonight. The hours passed slowly, and outside, the sound of crickets rose and fell in the quiet desert night. Inside the room, only the soft hum of the fan and the occasional creak of old pipes broke the silence. Keanu sat still in the visitor's chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hadn't moved in over an hour, and he didn't want to. He couldn't leave her side. Isabella slept lightly. Her breath was shallow and uneven. Every few minutes, she would wheeze softly, then take another breath. Keanu found himself counting her breaths without even realizing it. It had been so long since he had heard her voice. But even now, her presence made everything feel calm and safe. He remembered when he was a little boy, hiding under the kitchen table during one of his parents' loud arguments. Isabella had found him there, sat down beside him, and started reading a book without saying anything. She didn't ask questions or make promises. She just stayed with him. He had never forgotten that. Now he watched Isabella's chest rise and fall with each breath. Her face was weathered by time, but still kind and gentle, just like it had always been. She had always put others first. She still did. Keanu shifted in the chair, careful not to wake her. His back arched and his knees were stiff, but he didn't care. He didn't want to leave her side. The room was simple with just the basics. There were no soft pillows, no flowers, nothing fancy. Just a metal dresser, a cracked plastic pitcher, and a few books by the window. On the wall opposite her bed, there was a small cork board with photos pinned to it. Some were faded Polaroids while others were more recent. Keanu got up quietly and walked over to the corkboard. One picture caught his eye. It was of Isabella in her 30s, standing in front of a snowy porch in Toronto. She was holding young Keanu, who was wearing a bright winter coat. They were both laughing. Keanu remembered that day. The snow had come early, and Isabella had let him skip school to build a snow fort. His mother had been furious, but Isabella had just smiled and said, "He'll remember the laughter longer than the homework." Beneath the photo was a note written in Spanish. It was in a child's handwriting. Keanu leaned closer to read it. "Gracias, Nana Isabella," it said. "Thank you for taking care of me when no one else could." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, feeling overwhelmed. That boy had known even then how much Isabella had done for him. He had sensed it. He walked back to her bed and sat down again. Isabella stirred, blinking in her sleep. "Are you still here?" she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere," Keanu whispered. Isabella smiled even though she was tired. "Good," she said. I don't like goodbyes. Keanu squeezed her hand gently. Then I'll wait for the light. And with that, he settled back into his chair, his eyes never leaving hers as the night folded gently around the room. The sun slowly rose, shining orange and gold through the thin curtains. Isabella stirred again, blinking at the window as the sunlight filled the room. She looked at Keanu and her smile returned. You always were a stubborn one, she said, her voice soft and barely a whisper. Keanu chuckled softly. Take one to raise one. Isabella tried to laugh, but it came out as a breathless cough. Keanu poured her some water and held the cup for her. She took a sip and leaned back against the pillows. Did you sleep at all? She asked. No, Keanu answered. Not with you in here all alone. Isabella shook her head gently. I've been alone a long time, Keanu. It's just that no one noticed before. That simple sentence hurt Keanu deeply. He looked around the room at the cracked walls, the worn-out bed frame, and the old wheelchair in the corner. Isabella had been living like this, quietly, while the world rushed ahead. Keanu ran his hand through his hair, then stood up and stretched. He walked to her dresser and picked up the crayon drawing again. I remember when I gave you this, he said, holding it gently. I thought I was protecting you. You were, Isabella said. That was the week your parents separated. You heard them fighting and you thought I was in danger. You said, I'll be your knight now. Isabella's eyes misted over, but her smile stayed. You don't know how much I needed that. Keanu held the drawing close to his chest. You don't know how much I needed you. A long silence passed between them, full of warmth and everything they hadn't said over the years. Then Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. I'm not letting you spend another night in this place, he said, his voice firm. Isabella frowned, shaking her head. No, Keanu. That's not why I called. I didn't want you to feel guilty. Keanu shook his head. This isn't about guilt. It's about honor. You gave me everything you had when I had nothing. You made a little boy feel safe in a home full of silence. I can't fix everything, Isabella, but I can fix this. Isabella didn't argue. She just squeezed his hand. I always knew you'd grow up to do good things, she said softly. But this, she stopped, looking at him with awe. This is more than I ever imagined. Keanu looked her in the eyes. This isn't a good thing, Isabella. You are. He carried her bag himself, not the nurse or the driver. Isabella looked up at him from her wheelchair. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. I hope this isn't too much trouble. He smiled gently. It's not trouble, Isabella. It's long overdue. The drive to Los Angeles was quiet. Outside the window, the desert stretched out as Isabella drifted in and out of sleep. Keanu sat beside her, sometimes glancing at her, making sure the blanket stayed on her knees, and adjusting the airflow to keep her comfortable. He didn't look at his phone or take calls. He just sat quietly with her like when he was a child and she used to read to him during thunderstorms. When they arrived at the new care facility, it was in a peaceful place surrounded by eucalyptus trees. Isabella looked up at the building and blinked. There were flower beds and a small fountain by the entrance. Birds sang in the trees above, and the wind made the chimes near the door play soft sounds. Tears filled Isabella's eyes. She hadn't seen a place like this in a long time. Keanu knelt beside her and took her hand. Let's go home, he said softly. Isabella's new room was very comfortable. But it felt familiar, like someone had made it to match her memories. The walls were a soft, warm color, and the sunlight filled the room through a big window that looked out at a small garden full of lavender and rosemary. There were no buzzing lights here, only natural light and the soft smell of lemon oil from the polished wood furniture. In the corner of the room was a strong oak dresser with a delicate cloth on top. A ceramic lamp shaped like a swan sat there too, just like the one she had in Toronto when she first moved from Mexico all those years ago. But what took her breath away was a small round table by the window. On it was a porcelain tea set with tiny hand-painted roses. Isabella reached out, trembling, and touched one of the cups. This can't be, she whispered, her voice shaking. Keanu was already setting down her overnight bag beside the closet. He looked at her and smiled. It's the same set, he said softly. The one we used in Toronto on Saturdays. I found it by looking up an old photo and tracing the maker's mark. Isabella put her hands over her mouth, surprised. How did you remember? Keanu pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. You made chamomile tea with honey whenever I was sick or sad. You always used this set and it stuck with me. Then Isabella noticed something else. On a small side table was an old, slightly chipped music box. She gasped. No, it couldn't be. Keanu smiled. It's a replica. Yours was long gone, but I remembered the tune. It took some time, but we found it. He wound up the tiny key, and the soft melody of a lullaby began to play. The same tune she had played for him when he was little, to comfort him during his parents' arguments late at night. Isabella cried silently, her hands in her lap. These weren't just gifts. They were pieces of her past, things that no one else had remembered. She looked around the room slowly. There was even a black and white photo on the dresser. It showed her, much younger, holding a book with a smiling boy beside her. Keanu, when he was 7, grinning with a missing tooth, his face full of mischief. You remembered everything, she whispered. Keanu leaned forward and spoke softly. You were the first person who saw me for who I was. Not what I could be, not what I should be, just me. Isabella reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. Then maybe, just maybe, I did something right. The room was quiet for a moment, the music box playing its last note. Isabella sat back in her chair, feeling overwhelmed but peaceful. She looked out the window at the garden swaying in the breeze. It was so different from the place she had come from, the cracked tiles and flickering lights. Here time seemed slower, safer, and kinder. Keanu stood up and walked over to a shelf near the closet. He took down a small box wrapped in an old ribbon and held it out to her. One more thing, he said. Isabella untied the ribbon, her hands trembling again. Inside was a worn paperback copy of Romeo and Juliet. The cover was almost completely faded. Isabella's eyes widened. This is... Keanu nodded. Your copy. The one you gave me when I was 9. I found it in a box I never threw away. Isabella ran her fingers over the worn pages. A small smile appeared on her face. You used to ask me why Juliet didn't just run away, she said softly. You always wanted every story to have a better ending. Keanu smiled. I still do. They sat in silence for a while, hands still resting on the table. A nurse knocked softly on the door. Miss Mendoza, would you like your tea now? Isabella looked at the tea set by the window and smiled, tears in her eyes. Yes, I think I would. The nurse came in, moving with grace, clearly trained by someone who cared. She placed the tray on the table and poured the tea, offering a small jar of honey without asking for help. Isabella blinked. Just like I used to do, she whispered. Keanu stayed for a little while longer. He didn't rush. He didn't look at his phone. He just sat with her as the light in the room changed, casting golden shadows across the carpet. Even though he was a man known for his silence, there was something deeply meaningful in the stillness he shared with her. Before leaving, he knelt by her chair and looked her in the eyes. You're not alone anymore. Isabella squeezed his hand one last time. I never was I? Keanu shook his head. Then he stepped out, leaving behind the warmth of memories, the kindness of reunion, and a promise in everything he had done. He remembered her. He always would. The mornings were different now. No more cold silences of cracked tiles and a broken heater. Now, Isabella's days started with the soft sounds of birds in the courtyard, the gentle splash of the fountain, and the laughter of visiting families. But most mornings, what Isabella looked forward to was Keanu's knock on the door. He never made a big entrance. It was always just a soft knock, then the quiet creak of the door, and there he was, wearing his favorite black cap and carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea from the little cafe across the street. Always the same, just like when he was 10 and couldn't sleep. Isabella would pretend to be surprised. Oh, the night returns, she'd say. Keanu would smile. Only to rescue the queen. They would laugh together and she'd pat the chair beside her. These visits became a routine, but they were never ordinary. Some days they talked about small things like books or old TV shows, or the nurse who looked like a young Al Pacino. Other days they didn't talk at all, just enjoying the silence that carried the weight of all the years. One day Keanu brought something more than tea. It was a leather-bound notebook with worn edges, filled with memories and thoughts he had written down over the years. It was his private journal, the one no one had ever seen. Isabella stared at it. You wrote all this? He nodded. Some of it's nonsense. Some of it's about you. Isabella opened it to a page marked with a dried chamomile flower. The ink was old and faded, but the words were clear. She saved me. Not by doing big things, but by being the one person who stayed. Stayed when others left. When I thought silence was the only safe place, she showed me kindness. I didn't need noise. Isabella's hand went to her chest. Is that about me? Keanu nodded. They sat in silence for a while, the soft breeze moving the pages of the journal. Later, Isabella told Keanu something she had kept secret for many years. I never told you, she began, her voice softer than usual. But when you were about 10, your mother thought about sending you to a military school. Keanu looked up, puzzled. What? She thought it might help you. She thought you were too quiet, too lost in your drawings. But I told her no. I told her if she sent you there, it would crush your gentle soul. Keanu sat back, shocked. You what? I told her if she sent you to military school, it would be the wrong place for you. You were different, Keanu. Sensitive but not weak. You saw things others didn't, felt things they ignored. The wrong place would have taken that away. Keanu blinked, trying to understand. I always wondered why she changed her mind. One day she was packing brochures and the next it was just dropped. Isabella smiled softly. I didn't argue. I just reminded her of who you really were and who you could become. Keanu looked away, his voice low. I never thanked you. Isabella smiled gently. You didn't have to. But the words came out anyway, quiet and raw. Thank you. Isabella's eyes filled with tears again. I didn't do it for thanks, she whispered. I did it because you mattered. Keanu nodded. You didn't just raise me. You saved me. The afternoon sun warmed the floor. The tea between them grew cold, but neither of them moved. They just sat in the stillness, holding on to memories, holding on to truth. For a moment, Keanu looked like a young boy again, not the famous man everyone knew, but a boy sitting on the kitchen floor of a small apartment, listening to Isabella hum as she folded laundry. He remembered how she used to set out a tiny plate of crackers shaped like stars, calling them astronaut food. She would tell him, "You'll go far someday, little one, but promise me you'll remember who packed your bag." And he had. It had just taken him years to understand what that really meant. Isabella leaned back on her pillow, looking out the window. You know, people always think children don't notice things. But you saw everything even when you didn't say a word. Keanu admitted, I watched everything. I just didn't know what to do with it back then. Isabella smiled gently. You figured it out. You've done well. Keanu shook his head. No, I tried. Isabella's voice was firm. No, you didn't try. You choose kindness over and over. That's not just luck or instinct. That's the soul. Keanu's throat tightened. Isabella reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his. I never had children, she said softly, but when people ask, I tell them I raised a good man. Keanu bowed his head, trying to hold back tears. That evening, Keanu stayed longer than usual. They didn't talk much after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had been said already filled the room. Isabella eventually drifted to sleep, her hand still holding his. Keanu sat beside her, quietly watching her breathe, listening to the soft hum of the oxygen machine in the corner. The music box, long silent, played its last fading note. But the memories were still there, playing in their minds. Keanu took a small notebook from his pocket and wrote down a few lines. Not a script, just the truth, just her. The nurse peeked in, surprised to see him still there. She sleeps best when you're here, she said. Keanu whispered, I know. So did I. As the night got later, he sat by the window in the visitor's chair, his legs folded just like when he was a boy. He watched the shadows move on the wall, listening to the soft sounds of the woman sleeping in the bed. It felt like a special moment, just the two of them, no cameras, no bright lights. It was just him and the woman who had helped him when he was younger. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small that he had brought with him. It was a little wooden figure of a knight on a horse. He had found it years ago in a market in Prague when he was making a movie. The figure reminded him of a picture he once drew for her, the one she had framed and kept. In the picture he was the knight. He carefully placed the wooden knight on her nightstand next to a photo of them together, smiling. He whispered softly, You never stopped fighting for me. The woman, Isabella, stirred in her sleep and mumbled, You were always worth it. He closed his eyes and let the quiet fill the room. That night, Keanu Reeves, the famous actor known for being calm and strong in his roles, slept in a simple chair beside the woman who had helped him when he was a child. She had always been there for him and he never needed the spotlight to shine. She had always been his light. It all started quietly like most things do. Isabella Lily had come to visit and brought some new herbal teas and soft clothes for Isabella. Keanu had asked her to pick out clothes in earth colors because that's what Isabella liked. It was a quiet morning at the care center. The only sound was a soft song on the radio near the nurse's station. Isabella was sitting by the window in a chair with a book on her lap. She had her eyes closed and the book had slipped out of her hands. Lily didn't want to disturb her, but something about Isabella's peaceful face made her feel like she should stay. Lily had seen many people in Keanu's life, but Isabella was different. She wasn't like the people who followed Keanu around. She was one of the few people Keanu always cared about. Isabella slowly opened her eyes when Lily walked in. She smiled a little, tired but kind. You again, she said. Lily smiled back. Yes, me again. I brought the mint tea you like and a few new clothes. I thought you might want to change. Isabella smiled again. You're very kind, but I've never been one for too much fuss. Lily sat down across from her. For a while neither of them spoke. The only sound was the birds outside the window. Then Lily started to talk. I've known Keanu for almost 10 years, Lily said. I've been with him when people ask about his childhood, but he never talks much about it. He's private. But recently he mentioned you for the first time. He said your name and that you were the reason he became who he is. Isabella looked surprised. Not upset, just surprised, like someone who never expected to be remembered. Lily continued, I've read every article about him. I've helped with his archives, but your name isn't in any of them. It's like you were never there. Isabella smiled quietly. That sounds about right. But you were there, Lily said gently. You were everything when he was young. Isabella took a sip of her tea and stared out the window. I wasn't family, she said after a long pause. I was just the help. Women like me don't make it into the stories. We're just in the background doing things people forget to remember. Lily leaned forward. But Keanu didn't forget. And I don't think he ever could. That's why I want to write something for him. Not for the public, just a private memoir. Something that honors what you did and who you are. Isabella looked thoughtful. After a long pause, she said, You can write it, but promise me something. Don't let him read it until I'm gone. I promise, Lily said softly. The next day, Lily came back with a voice recorder and a journal. Isabella smiled when she saw them, running her fingers over the journal like it was an old treasure. I've never been interviewed before, Isabella said, with a little laugh in her tired eyes. Are you sure I'm interesting enough for this? Lily smiled warmly. You shaped a child who grew up to shape millions. I think that makes you interesting. They started slowly. Isabella insisted on making the tea herself, even though the staff offered to help. She said the ritual of making tea was important. She moved slowly but with the same care she had when she made meals for Keanu when he was young. Lily noticed Isabella's hands shook slightly, but she never asked for help. Isabella started to tell her story. I came to Canada when I was 20, she said. I was from a small village in Veracruz. My cousin had moved to Toronto, and she told me I could find a better life there. I didn't speak much English, but I learned. My first job was cleaning office buildings at night, Isabella continued. Then I got a job with a family. That's how I ended up in Keanu's house. He was just 5 years old. He was quiet too. Lily listened closely, writing down some notes in the journal. His parents were busy, always working, Isabella said. But Keanu, he lived in his own world. He would sit for hours drawing pictures of dinosaurs, airplanes, and castles. He didn't play with toys. He just lined them up like they were characters on a stage. Did he talk to you? Lily asked softly. Isabella nodded. At night, when the house was quiet and he couldn't sleep, he would come find me. We'd sit in the kitchen. I'd make cinnamon toast and he'd ask questions about everything. Why the moon follows us, why people cry, why grown-ups yell when they're scared. Her voice cracked a little. He was 5, Lily. 5, and already he carried more weight than most adults. He didn't just want answers, he wanted to understand them. He wanted to hold the truth in his hands. Lily felt sad hearing about the young boy who would become Keanu, sitting on the kitchen floor asking big questions. Did you ever feel like family? Lily asked gently. Isabella smiled softly, her eyes distant. He made me feel like family even if the world never did. Lily turned off the recorder for now. That was enough for today, but Isabella had many more stories to tell, and the truth was just beginning to unfold. The next afternoon, Lily returned with more pages printed from what they had recorded the day before. Isabella wanted to hear her words read aloud to see how they would sound on paper. Lily read softly. She smelled like cinnamon toast and safety. She moved through the house like a guardian, and when my world felt too big, she made it feel small enough to breathe in. Isabella blinked, surprised. That's from him, she said quietly. Lily nodded. It's from a journal Keanu wrote when he was in his 20s. He never showed it to anyone, but I found it while researching this. I think you lived in his heart longer than you realized. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. I didn't need him to remember me, she said. I only needed him to be okay. Lily hesitated. Would you like to leave him a letter? Isabella sat still for a long time, then nodded. Yes, but he can't read it until I'm gone. Promise me that. I promise, Lily said softly. That evening, Isabella wrote a letter to Keanu. It was small and simple, just a note that said, For Keanu when it's time. The letter was sealed and placed on her dresser. The next morning the care center felt different. There was a quiet buzz in the air. A new sign on the door read, "The Rose Room." Keanu stood outside the room feeling proud and calm. He had spent weeks planning this moment. Inside the room, everything was perfect. There were bookshelves with books, a comfortable chair by the window, and a small garden full of roses. These roses were special. They were the same kind Isabella had grown in Keanu's childhood home. He remembered the smell and the way Isabella would talk to the plants like they were her children. Keanu walked into the room with Isabella. She was surprised, but when she saw the roses and the books, she smiled with tears in her eyes. "You remembered?" she whispered. Keanu smiled and leaned down. "Every single thing." Keanu wheeled Isabella closer to the roses. Her hand shook a little as she reached out to touch a pink rose that had just bloomed. She gently touched its soft petals and felt like she was young again, kneeling in a garden in Toronto. She remembered the dirt under her nails and the warm sun on her back. "These are Rosa New Dawn," she whispered, amazed. "I haven't seen this kind of rose in many years." Keanu nodded. "You told me once they were your favorite. I asked a gardener to help find them. We found them in British Columbia." Isabella smiled softly, laughing through her tears. "You really remembered?" "I remember everything," Keanu said quietly. Then a nurse brought over a small teacup. It was made of porcelain with a faded pink edge. Isabella looked at it for a long time. It was the same kind of cup they used to use for tea in the kitchen after school. She saved it for special days like birthdays or when she felt sad. "I kept one," Keanu said, placing another cup on the table beside her. It was cracked, but he never threw it away. Isabella didn't say anything. She just held the teacup and pressed it to her lips, like it was made of gold. Around them, some staff members, residents, and a few of Keanu's team watched quietly. There were no cameras, no media. Just the people who mattered, there for a moment that felt bigger than anything on the news. Lily, the activities director, stepped forward and spoke. "We are so happy to open this new space today," she said. "It will be both a reading room and a garden for everyone here to enjoy. But this room means more than that. It's a tribute to someone who changed a life in a quiet way, someone whose impact you won't find in magazines or on TV, but whose love is felt deeply by one man who never forgot her." Lily turned to Isabella, who was still gazing at the roses. "This is the Rose Room, named after your flowers and your love." The crowd clapped softly. Some residents wiped tears from their eyes. A caregiver in the back clapped with a tissue in her hand, feeling emotional. Isabella's chin trembled as she turned to Keanu. "I never thought anyone would remember the flowers I planted." "Not really." Keanu knelt beside her, gently placing his hand over hers. "You didn't just plant flowers," he said. "You planted peace. You planted hope. And I think the world needs more of both." Isabella stared at him, her eyes full of quiet pride. She never wanted praise, but now she understood that sometimes, kindness and care are the most important things, even if no one else notices. That was everything to her. The rest of the afternoon felt like a memory she didn't know she still had. As guests talked and tea was served, Isabella found herself surrounded by faces that had only ever known her as a quiet resident. A woman in her 70s wearing a pale yellow sweater sat next to her. "I used to be a florist," the woman said softly. "When I saw the garden, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Hope." "Thank you." Isabella put her hand on her chest. "I didn't do this. You did." The woman smiled, "Because someone loved you enough to show the rest of us what that looks like." By sunset, the Rose Room glowed with a soft amber light. Keanu helped Isabella out of her wheelchair and into a comfortable chair by the tall window. The roses were in the distance, their petals glowing in the last light of the day. Isabella sighed deeply. "I never thought I'd see something like this again." Keanu sat next to her, his legs crossed and hands in his lap. "When you took care of me, you never asked for anything. Not praise, not thanks. Just a safe place to be. This is me giving that back to you." Isabella looked around at the shelves of books, the soft music, and the walls painted with a color she once called sunlight trapped in paint. She smiled, her smile small but bright. "You remembered it all." Keanu looked at her, his eyes shining. "I couldn't forget, Isabella. You taught me that the world isn't just noise. Silence, kindness, and care matter the most." Isabella reached out and took his hand, fragile but steady. "I worried, that when I left, I'd disappear from your story." "You were never just a part of the story," Keanu said. "You were the reason. And I kept going when it didn't make sense." Isabella closed her eyes briefly, resting her head back in the chair. The world around them hummed softly, laughter in the hallway, birds chirping in the garden, and the sound of feet moving on the polished floor. It was all so peaceful, so ordinary. Then she whispered so softly that Keanu almost didn't hear it. Now I understand. This room, this garden, it's not just a gift. Keanu leaned closer, listening carefully. What do you mean? Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. It's proof that I was never invisible. And with that, the rose room bloomed, not just with flowers but with everything Isabella had quietly planted in a boy who grew up remembering the hands that helped raise him. Word about the rose room spread slowly at first, like a quiet ripple in a calm lake. Most of the people at the care home were used to their daily routines. But something felt different ever since Isabella Mendoza moved in. It started with the staff noticing something special. A man came to visit, wearing a plain baseball cap and sunglasses. He was quiet and humble, never drawing attention. But he didn't just visit, he stayed. He laughed, he listened, he brought books, and he helped with things. He even made tea when Isabella couldn't. For a while no one asked who he was. Maybe out of respect, or maybe because people in places like this were used to being ignored. But then Julia, one of the night nurses, figured it out. She had been tucking a resident in near Isabella's room when she heard Isabella laughing softly. Keanu, you still take your tea with too much honey. I warned you when you were a boy, it would rot your teeth. The voice that answered was quiet and gentle. Julia froze. She knew that voice. The next morning, Julia took a photo of Isabella and Keanu sitting under the blooming rose trellis. Isabella's hand was resting on his wrist, and Keanu was listening closely to her, like he was hearing a story that mattered. The tenderness in the picture said more than any words could. Later, Julia posted the photo online, anonymously, with a short message. This woman used to care for a little boy no one thought would amount to much. She believed in him when no one else did. He grew up and never forgot her. Today he visits her every day in our care home. Kindness is real. So is gratitude. The photo quickly went viral. People started sharing it everywhere. News outlets started writing about it. Keanu Reeves quietly honors childhood nanny. Secret visits melt hearts. Who is Isabella Mendoza, the woman behind the man? But neither Keanu nor Isabella had approved of any of it. At first, Isabella didn't know. She didn't have social media, but the nurses started acting differently. They were more affectionate, and some volunteers even arrived with flowers, saying they were inspired by the story. Isabella didn't understand. Then Lily, the activities director, showed her the photo on her phone. Looky, I think you should see this. Isabella stared at the phone screen. She saw the picture of her and Keanu under the roses. She looked peaceful, happy, and older, but still herself. Keanu was beside her, listening closely. Her fingers trembled above the phone. After a long moment, Isabella spoke. Why would someone post this? Lily answered softly, I think they just wanted to share something beautiful. Isabella handed the phone back slowly, feeling worn out. This wasn't meant for the world. I know, Lily said gently. But people aren't reacting to your illness. They're responding to your life, your heart, and how you showed up for someone who never forgot you. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. It was never about being noticed. I was just doing my job. You weren't just the help, Lily said softly. You were everything to him. That night, Keanu came to visit as usual, not knowing about the online storm. He brought a small box with an old Polaroid photo inside. It was of him when he was 9, wearing a paper crown Isabella had made for him. He was standing on a milk crate like it was a stage. Isabella was behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder, smiling. Keanu handed it to her. I thought you might want to keep this in the rose room. Isabella smiled through her tears. Keanu, something's happened. She told him about the photo going viral, the volunteers, the new visitors, and how people were calling her the nanny who raised a legend. Keanu sat quietly. He asked, Do you want me to stop it? Isabella paused, then shook her head. No, don't hide it. Just promise me something. Anything, Keanu said. Promise me you won't speak for me. Let me be seen, but on my own terms. Keanu nodded. You deserve to be known, Isabella. You always did. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice warm. You didn't raise me to stay quiet. Not when it matters. Isabella smiled faintly, then whispered, Then let them see who I really am. Isabella Mendoza sat by the window in her new care home, a knitted shawl around her shoulders, and a teacup resting quietly in her lap. The sunlight streamed through the rose vines outside, casting gentle patterns on the floor. She had gotten used to the peaceful routine of this place, to the quiet respect she was given. But today felt different. A small ripple in the stillness came in the form of Lily, Keanu's assistant. She knocked politely on the door. "Isabella," Lily said with a smile. "There's someone who would like to speak with you if you're open to it." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Her name is Lena Tran. She's a journalist. She read about the Rose Room and figured out who you are." Isabella frowned. "No, thank you." Lily nodded, expecting the answer. "That's okay. I just wanted to ask." But then Isabella's great-niece Clara, who had been visiting, spoke up. "Tia, can I say something?" Isabella turned to her. "Of course." Clara took Isabella's hand. "I think you should do it." Isabella was surprised. "What? So can people talk about Keanu again? So they can stare at me like I'm some trivia?" "No," Clara said softly. "So they can see you. All the other women like you. The ones who give and give but never get noticed." Clara squeezed Isabella's hand. "You always said the quiet ones make the biggest difference. Maybe it's time someone said that out loud." Isabella looked out the window at the blooming roses. She thought about her mother, who worked hard cleaning other people's homes. She thought of her sisters, who raised other people's children but never got the credit. Maybe Clara was right. Isabella sighed. "But only on my terms." Lily turned around, her face lighting up. "What should we call it?" she asked. Lucia spoke slowly. "This story isn't about Keanu. It's about caregivers, the people who love others without asking for anything in return. It should be written that way or not at all." "I'll tell Lena," Lily said, already pulling out her phone. "She'll understand and be happy." Lucia nodded. "Then I'll speak." The next afternoon Lena Tran arrived. She was younger than Lucia thought, maybe in her early 30s, with a calm presence that made the room feel peaceful. It didn't feel like an interview, it felt like a chat between old friends. Lucia sat up straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. Her tea was still untouched. "You know," she started, "I only agreed to this because I want people to understand something." Lena nodded. "I'm here to listen." Lucia looked out the window, her thoughts far away. "I wasn't family," she said quietly. "I wasn't even really staff, not the kind you'd find in a movie credit or a memoir. I was just there, quiet, a shadow in the background." Her eyes were lost in memories. "But I loved him. And I fought for him. That matters, doesn't it?" "It matters," Lena said softly. She wrote nothing down for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. Lucia took a deep breath. "When Keanu was young, he was very quiet. People thought that meant he was weak, but I knew better. There was strength in his silence, the kind that lasts." Lena gently asked, "Tell me about the day you met him." Lucia smiled. "He was 5 years old. He hid behind the curtain and watched me mop the floor. He didn't speak at first, just watched. The next day he brought me a cookie from the kitchen and said, 'My name is Keanu. You worked too hard.'" Lucia laughed softly. "I told him that hard work makes you strong." Lucia's stories came easily, and she told Lena about the quiet moments they shared. She spoke of how Keanu would read books out loud on rainy afternoons, his voice shaky with each new word. She also remembered when he fell from a tree and wouldn't cry because he wanted to be brave like her. But Lucia also shared the harder times, the ones no child ever hears about. She remembered when Keanu's parents thought about sending him to a military school because they thought he was too sensitive. Lucia had stood up to them, telling them that if they did that, they would break him and he would never be the same again. They didn't listen to many people back then, but that time they listened to her. Lena blinked, moved by Lucia's words. "You changed the whole course of his life," she said softly. Lucia waved her hand as if it wasn't a big deal. "I just kept the wind at his back. That's what caregivers do." The interview lasted 2 hours, but the conversation could have gone on much longer. When Lena left, she promised to write the story exactly as Lucia wanted. No spotlight, no drama, just the truth. Lucia sat quietly after the door closed. "Let the world see," she whispered, "but only what matters." 3 days later, the article was published, titled, "The Woman Who Saved Keanu Reeves." But it wasn't just about Keanu. Lena's words focused on Lucia, not as a servant or background person, but as a quiet strength behind one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. The article celebrated her love, her strength, and the caregivers like her who do so much without asking for recognition. The internet reacted quickly. Comments flooded in. "My grandma was the Lucia in my life. I'm crying. Every caregiver deserves this kind of recognition, and this woman shows us what real love looks like." Lucia didn't say much when she saw the article. She just looked at the photo of her younger self, smiling next to a young boy with dark eyes and shy hands. When Keanu visited that evening, He found her sitting next to a vase of fresh roses, tears in her eyes. "They know now," she whispered. Keanu knelt beside her, his eyes gentle. "They should have known all along," he said. Lukia held his hand just like when he was 5. "I never wanted to be famous," she said. "I just wanted to be remembered." One day Lukia gave Keanu an envelope. It was plain and a little bent, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "Don't open it until I'm gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Keanu hesitated, but he promised. "I won't open it." She let go of the letter, and it fell softly onto her lap. That night, Keanu stayed with her longer than usual. She had become quieter, sleeping more often. The staff at the care home were kind, but everyone knew something precious was coming to an end. When Lukia woke, Keanu took her hand and asked, "Is there anything you need, Lukia?" She smiled softly and said, "Music." The next day, a shiny black piano arrived at the care home. It was the same kind of piano Keanu had played on when he was young. Keanu played beautiful songs for her, starting with a song by Celine Dion, then an old lullaby Lukia used to sing when he couldn't sleep. Finally, he played a song he wrote just for her. Lukia cried through the entire last song, not loudly, just quietly, letting the tears fall. Clara, Lukia's great niece, watched from across the room, her hand over her heart. She had become close to Lukia in the last few months, often visiting after school. She took out her phone, shaking slightly. Lukia noticed and nodded. Clara whispered, "Are you sure?" Lukia nodded again. "Please share it." Later that night, Clara posted the video with the caption, "For the woman who raised him." She asked me to share it. By morning, the video had over 1 million views. People commented from all over the world, "I've never cried so much. This is love. I don't even like classical music, but this made me feel something." Some people wanted to know who the woman in the chair was. They wanted to know about the woman who had helped raise a famous actor and who had always loved without asking for anything in return. Keanu didn't say anything on social media. He didn't talk to the press, but that afternoon he brought Lukia a newspaper. On the front page was a photo from the video of him playing the piano, with Lukia sitting beside him, smiling. He set the paper on her lap. "They printed this," he said softly. Lukia looked at the photo for a long time. "No makeup," she said dryly, and then laughed a little. "I look like an old ghost." "You look like my whole childhood," Keanu said gently. Lukia didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and rested her head against the cushion. Later she whispered, "Promise me something." "Anything," Keanu said. "When I'm gone and people ask, don't make it about me." Keanu frowned. "What do you mean?" "Make it about the forgotten ones. The ones no one visits. The ones who still wait by the phone, hoping a child they helped raise remembers their name." Keanu nodded. "I will." She smiled faintly. "You always listen more than you talked. That's what I liked about you." That night, Clara told Keanu, "She's not afraid, but I think she's getting ready." Keanu sat in the hallway outside Lukia's room for a long time after that. The hallway smelled like roses, just like the ones Lukia used to grow. He still hadn't opened the letter, but he touched his jacket pocket where it rested, pressing softly against his chest. That night, as the rain tapped on the windows, Lukia whispered to Clara, "I've lived enough." She smiled one last time and fell asleep peacefully. The next morning the air was cool and soft. Lukia, wrapped in a pale shawl, said quietly, "I want to see where the children go." "The place you built." Keanu smiled gently. "You mean the shelter?" Lukia nodded. "Yes. You told me once it was where you planted hope for those who had no one. I want to see it, maybe plant something there." They went to the shelter, where Keanu had helped fund a place for kids from broken homes. It was a beautiful place where the children could find love and safety. When they arrived, Lukia looked around, amazed. "You never told me it was this beautiful." "You never asked," Keanu said softly. "But I always hoped you'd see it." They went to a quiet patch of land where Keanu had saved space for something special. "This is where it goes," he said. "Whatever you want to plant here." Lukia smiled. "We'll need rosemary for memory, lavender for healing, and white roses for new beginnings." Keanu smiled and nodded, and they started planning. Lily, who had been with them, quietly took notes. The garden grew slowly over the next week. Keanu stayed every day helping the children, and they worked together, planting the flowers Lukia had chosen. When the garden was finished, there was no press, just the children, staff, and a few people who had helped. The air smelled of rosemary and lavender. There was a plaque in the garden that said, "For the ones who gave without needing applause." Lukia traced the words with her fingers, her hands trembling slightly. "That's more than I ever dreamed," she whispered. Keanu knelt beside her. You deserve so much more. Lucia shook her head. I didn't do it to be remembered. I did it because you were a child who needed kindness. Keanu's voice was thick with emotion. Because of that, I learned what it meant to be human. The children began to sing, a soft song they had practiced for Lucia. She listened with her eyes closed, her heart full. When the song ended, Lucia opened her eyes and whispered, "Now I can rest." Keanu stayed with her longer, sitting quietly, looking at the garden they had planted together. "Promise me something," Lucia said softly. "Anything," Keanu replied. "Keep planting gardens even if I'm not here. Even if no one knows why." Keanu smiled faintly and took her hand. "I promise." As the sun set, casting golden light across the garden, Keanu realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The late afternoon sun shone softly through the window, making shadows on Isabella Mendoza's quiet room. The air was still, almost as if time itself was slowing down to respect her. Outside, the wind made the leaves in the care center's garden move, bringing the smell of lavender and rosemary. These were plants Isabella had helped pick for the children's shelter just weeks ago. Inside the room, the only sound was the gentle brushing of Keanu Reeves's fingers across Isabella's hand. She had been sleeping a lot more recently, eating less and speaking quietly. Her voice, which used to be full of warmth and fun, was now weak. But her eyes, those smart, bright eyes, still shined when they were open. Now they were closed, peaceful. Clara sat on the other side of the bed, holding Isabella's other hand. She was quiet, except for the soft hum of an old lullaby that Isabella used to sing to her when she was little. The doctors had said it could happen any time, and so Keanu stayed. He canceled his filming, left his meetings behind, and moved into the room next door. Some people called it devotion, but for him, it was just the right thing to do. He didn't want Isabella to be alone. That morning, Isabella woke up for a moment. She opened her lips to say one word, light. Keanu leaned close, not sure if she meant the light coming through the window or the light inside her. Clara whispered, "She's ready?" As the evening started, Isabella's breathing grew slower and softer until, with one final breath, it stopped. There was no panic, no loud alarms, just stillness. Keanu bowed his head, tears filling his eyes but not falling yet. Clara pressed her lips to Isabella's hand, then gently placed it over her chest. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Keanu whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't just thanking her for the years she had cared for him. He was thanking her for everything. She had been there for him when his life was falling apart. She had given without expecting anything back. She had helped him remember where his roots were planted. A few days later, under a big sky and surrounded by people who knew the real Isabella Mendoza, her funeral was held in a small chapel just outside Los Angeles. Keanu had asked for it to be private. No reporters, no big headlines, just the people who mattered. The room was full of nurses, workers from the care center, children from the shelter, and friends who had gotten close to her during her final days. Some knew her from the viral story that had been shared about her, and others knew her simply because she made them feel safe, heard, and important. At the front of the chapel was a simple wooden box, polished but plain. On top of it, there was a folded linen handkerchief with delicate embroidery and a rose beside it. There was also a sealed envelope marked, "To Keanu, read only when I'm gone." Keanu took it in his hands, which were trembling. "I haven't read this yet," he said. "Isabella gave it to me weeks ago. I promised I'd read it when the time was right." He looked around at the faces in the room. Then he slowly unfolded the letter. The paper was soft, slightly yellowed, and her handwriting was graceful and elegant, unmistakably Isabella. Keanu took a deep breath and began to read aloud. "My dear Keanu, if you are reading this, then my time in this world has quietly slipped away. Please don't be sad. My life has been long, and though not always easy, it has been full of meaning. When I came to care for you, I didn't know how deeply a child could change me. I was hired to cook and clean, to supervise. But what I found in you was something else, a soul I recognized. You were quiet, yes, but inside you so much life, so much light. I remember the first time I saw you cry, not because of pain, but because you felt something so deeply that your body didn't know what else to do. That moment told me everything. The world would be harsh on a child like that, but I knew I could help soften the edges." Keanu's voice trembled and he stopped to swallow. Then he went on, "There are things I never told you, like the day your mother came to me thinking about sending you to a military boarding school. She said you were too sensitive, too dreamy, and that you might not survive the world. I stood in her kitchen and said something I had never dared to say before. What you see as a weakness is his gift. He's not soft. He's tuned in. And if you crush that, you'll never forgive yourself. I risked everything by saying it, but she listened. You stayed, and that boy, my boy, got to grow into the man standing here now. Keanu's voice cracked. He looked down at the letter and tears began to fall. Clara moved closer and placed a hand on his back. He continued reading, quieter now. Please don't carry guilt for not finding me sooner. Life moves fast, but I was never far from you. Not really. You were always in my prayers, always in my heart. If this is the end of my story, I want it to be known that I had no regrets, except that I didn't get to see the boy I loved find peace sooner. But I see it in you now. That peace, that purpose, that goodness. And I rest knowing it's enough. Love always, Isabella. The chapel was silent. No one moved. Keanu folded the letter carefully back into its envelope and kissed the edge of it. She never asked for recognition, he whispered. Just for me to be kind in a world that needs it. The funeral ended quietly without applause or speeches. It was a procession of people who had known Isabella in their own quiet way, caregivers from the facility, gardeners who helped her pick plants for the legacy garden, children from the shelter who only knew her as Miss Isabella, the woman who smiled a lot. Each one left a flower beside her casket, and together, they created a beautiful mosaic of lives she had touched. After the service, Keanu stayed behind with Clara. The chapel was empty now, and the late afternoon light came through the stained glass windows, making the room glow with soft blues and ambers. She would have hated all this fuss, Clara whispered. Keanu gave a soft laugh. She'd be scolding me right now for not eating lunch. They sat together in silence for a while. The letter was folded and resting in Keanu's lap. His eyes stayed on the plaque at the back of the chapel that read, "In loving memory of Isabella Mendoza. She gave love quietly and asked nothing in return." I used to think I had to keep moving forward to honor her, Keanu said. Keep working, keep giving, keep pushing. But now I think part of honoring her is knowing when to stop, to feel. Clara nodded. She didn't want your success. She wanted your peace. Keanu looked up at the window. The sun was low now, casting a long beam of light across the chapel floor, making the dust particles shimmer in its glow. She gave me everything, he said softly. And I never knew just how much until now. Outside, as they stepped into the fresh evening air, the first star appeared in the sky. Clara looked up and asked, "Do you think she's still watching?" Keanu followed her gaze and nodded. Always. They walked together toward the car, and the silence between them was filled with memory and meaning. Before getting into the car, Keanu turned back to look at the chapel. He touched the envelope in his coat pocket, thinking about it not just as a letter, but as a map, a compass, a reminder of who he was before the fame and the person who had helped shape him into the man he had become. As they drove away from the quiet cemetery, Keanu's mind was still with Isabella in a kitchen long ago, where a quiet boy first learned what it meant to be seen and loved. After Isabella's funeral, Keanu found himself thinking more than usual. The world around him started to feel normal again with meetings, film scripts, and interviews, but something inside him resisted going back to how things were before. He couldn't just move on. Not after everything Isabella had meant to him. Not after the letter, not after reading it aloud to the people in the room who didn't really know her. Each morning, Keanu would visit the garden they had built together at the children's shelter. He'd sit by the plaque that read, "For the ones who gave without needing applause," and he would listen to the rosemary shrubs, the white lilies, and the sunflowers that leaned toward the light. He could hear them whispering to him. But just listening wasn't enough anymore. He started thinking about all the millions of women like Isabella, caregivers who gave love, patience, and work to raise other people's children, but who were aging without much support or thanks. Isabella had accepted being forgotten, but Keanu couldn't. One evening, as Keanu sat in his kitchen with a pot of tea on the stove, he began scribbling down his thoughts on the back of a grocery list. The idea came slowly but with clarity. He drew a circle, wrote a name, and formed a mission. In the center of the paper, he wrote, "The Isabella Initiative." It wouldn't be a charity like others. Isabella wouldn't have wanted that. It wouldn't have Keanu's face in commercials or big press conferences. It would simply help, quietly and respectfully, offering small grants to older caregivers, women like Isabella, who had no retirement plans, no savings, and no family. The money would help with housing, medical bills, and daily needs. No headlines, no big speeches. Just a quiet way to restore dignity. Keanu decided to fund it all himself, anonymously. By midnight, he had called his lawyer, his financial advisor, and Lily. She came the next morning with legal pads and coffee, and they worked in silence to create the framework. By noon, Lily had typed up the first draft of the mission statement, and Keanu added one final line. This is for the ones who showed up, stayed late, and loved without asking for anything in return. The initiative began quietly. Lily reached out to trusted social workers and agencies across the country. They told them about a private benefactor who wanted to help retired nannies and caregivers, women over 60 who had cared for children but were now struggling. There were no names, no big media. Just help. Soon, the stories began to come in. A woman in Baton Rouge who had worked for decades raising children but was now living in her car after a medical bill wiped out her savings. A nanny in Detroit who still cleaned houses despite a hip injury because she couldn't afford rent. A retired caregiver in Bakersfield, bedridden in a rundown apartment, no working heater. Lily reviewed each application carefully. Keanu read nearly all of them, not needing to see the faces, just understanding their words. Keanu refused to approve any large checks. Instead, he asked Lily to issue small grants, things like a few months of rent, a mobility aid, dental work, or grocery cards. Each person received a handwritten note, never signed by Keanu, just saying, "You are remembered." In a care facility in Omaha, a woman named Margarita wept when she opened a letter with new orthopedic shoes. In Georgia, Catherine, a widow, got a new mattress and a washer-dryer after 12 years of hand-washing clothes in a sink. Thank you letters started arriving, many written on floral stationery, each one closed with, "You must be an angel." As the initiative grew, Lily found herself overwhelmed. Keanu suggested Clara, Isabella's great-niece, who had been volunteering at a local shelter. Clara had the compassion, calm temperament, and sharp mind for the job. When Keanu asked if she would run the program full-time, she didn't hesitate. Clara began building the next phase of the Isabella initiative. She digitized the application process, trained volunteers, and created a quiet national network to support older caregivers. No publicity, no red tape, just help. Each recipient stayed anonymous. Clara called it the Book of Hands, an archive of the handwritten letters they received. Each note was a reminder of the invisible hands that had cared for generations of children, and now those hands were being held in return. Meanwhile, Keanu kept his distance from the day-to-day operations but continued visiting local homes. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes just conversation. He listened to the women who had been overlooked for so long. He didn't introduce himself as a celebrity, just a listener. Isabella's name became more than a memory. It became a movement, one built on restoration and dignity, not fame. Clara often said, "We don't spotlight these women. We steady them." The fund grew slowly but steadily, not because of promotions but because word spread through communities, churches, nursing homes, libraries, friends telling other friends. One day, Keanu got a letter written in Spanish. The letter ended with a simple sentence. "Because you remembered her, now someone remembers me." Keanu put the letter beside Lucy's last letter. He whispered the same thing he had said to her before she passed away, "I didn't forget you, and now the world won't either." The building stood on a quiet street in Toronto. A soft spring breeze blew, and the smell of nearby cherry blossoms filled the air. This had once been Keanu's childhood home, but now it was something different. However, in many ways, it had come full circle. Keanu stepped out of a small black SUV and stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building. The outside of the building had been carefully fixed. The white-painted bricks were clean and the steps were nice. A wooden sign that said "The Bright Path Learning Center" hung on the front. Keanu hadn't been here for many years, but today wasn't about remembering. It was about honoring someone. The nonprofit group had taken over the building last year. Keanu quietly helped pay for it. The center's goal was simple: to help kids who didn't have much by giving them tutoring, emotional support, and a safe place to dream. Today, however, something more special was happening. A new room inside the center was being opened, and it wasn't named after a famous person or a big donor. It was named after a woman the world had just learned about. Keanu met Lily at the door of the center. She nodded gently at him. She didn't need to say much. The air already felt heavy with memories. Inside, Keanu could hear the sound of laughter. Kids were moving around between art tables and bean bags. The walls were covered with colorful posters. But Keanu didn't look around at all. He walked straight toward the hallway where a new sign had just been put up: the Isabella Mendoza Learning Room. He stood in front of the plaque for a moment and gently touched the edge. Below Isabella's name was a short sentence in fancy writing: "She believed in one child, and that changed everything." Clara walked in slowly behind him. She was holding a folder filled with thank you letters from the kids who had already started coming to the center. When Clara read the words on the plaque, she stopped. Her fingers tightened around the papers. "It's too much," she whispered. Keanu smiled quietly. "That's why we had to do it," he said softly. The door to the room opened, and inside, soft golden light filled the space through the wide windows. The room smelled like crayons, wood, and maybe a little bit of lavender, like the kind Isabella used to put in the laundry. There were bookshelves along the walls, oversized pillows in one corner for reading, and blocks and dress-up costumes in another. But in the middle of the room there was a large, round rug. It was big enough for 10 kids to sit in a circle. The rug had colorful stars and vines stitched into it. Clara knelt beside the rug. "She sewed this by hand," she said softly. "I found it in her old trunk." Keanu felt a lump in his throat. The edges of the rug were frayed, and the blue had faded. But it was clearly the rug Isabella had made for him when he was 6. Back then he used it to pretend he was in a castle, protecting it from dragons. Now it was a place for children to imagine and play, just like Isabella had always wanted. Clara gently touched the fabric. "She would be proud," she said. Keanu nodded, his voice tight. A group of volunteers and teachers stood in the hallway, waiting quietly. Most of them had only just learned who Isabella Mendoza really was. To them, she had gone from being a quiet caregiver in an old photo to someone much more important. She was now a symbol of the quiet love and sacrifice that had changed a boy's life. Keanu walked into the room and stopped near a window. On a small table there was a display. He knelt down to look at it. Inside a glass frame were 3 things: an old photograph of Isabella with young Keanu sitting beside her on the porch steps, a copy of the book, The Secret Garden, that she used to read to him, and a small note she had once written in Spanish. The note said, "Every child deserves to be seen." Keanu stood up slowly. Those words had once been said by Isabella when she was folding his socks and cleaning the floor. And now, those same words were forever on display for children she would never meet, but whose lives she would still touch. Just then, a teacher walked in with a small group of children, maybe 6 or 7 kids, all between 5 and 10 years old. The teacher smiled. "Would it be okay if they played for a while?" she asked. Keanu stepped aside and gently waved his hand. "Please," he said. "That's what the room is for." The kids hesitated for a moment, sensing the importance of the moment. Then one little girl skipped over to the rug and dropped down, pulling a puzzle from the nearby bin. The other kids followed, building towers, flipping through picture books, and sharing crayons. And just like that, the room came alive. Keanu stood there quietly, his arms folded. He wasn't thinking about movies or awards or being famous. He was thinking about one person's belief, Isabella's belief in him, and how that had made this moment possible. A volunteer came up to Clara and handed her a tablet. "You need to see this," she whispered. Clara opened the tablet and saw a bunch of messages, along with pictures from different places across the country. There were teachers and librarians showing support after hearing Isabella's story. One message was from a teacher in Alabama who used the article about Isabella to teach her students about kindness. Another message came from a librarian in Vermont who added a Isabella room to their reading corner. There was even a video from a little boy in Texas reading, "She believed in one child." Clara handed Keanu the tablet. "It came in this morning," she said. Her voice was full of emotion. "Isabella didn't just change your life. She's changing hundreds." Keanu looked at the screen for a long time. He whispered, "She never wanted recognition." Clara nodded. "That's why it means so much now." Keanu looked back at the rug, the books, and the sunlight shining softly on the children's faces. Isabella would never have expected her name on the door of this room. But she would have sat beside a child, handed them a storybook, and stayed long enough for them to feel safe. And now, because of her, they always would. The observatory sat quietly on a hill outside Los Angeles. It was far enough from the city lights to see the stars, but close enough to feel the weight of the sky. On this evening, the sky was clear, deep, and full of stars, just as Keanu had hoped. He stood beside Clara at the entrance, both of them bundled up against the cool spring air. Clara looked at him with a mix of excitement and confusion. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Keanu smiled softly. "She always told me to look up when I was scared," he said. "Now, I just want to give her a reason to be looked up to." They stepped inside the observatory. It smelled like books, metal, and history. An older man named Dr. Simon Grant greeted them. He had spent over 50 years studying the sky and naming stars. But this request, he said, was different. "I've never seen someone so sure," Dr. Grant said when Keanu reached out to him. "Most people just pick a bright star." Keanu nodded. "She wasn't loud," he said softly, "but she never faded." Dr. Grant flipped a switch, and the huge dome above them began to rotate slowly. The telescope pointed toward a tiny light billions of miles away. "I've got it centered," Dr. Grant said. This star, catalogued as HD 134560, is yours now. It's been renamed Isabella Mendoza. Clara gasped and stepped forward, looking through the telescope. Tears filled her eyes. It's so steady, she whispered. She was, Keanu replied. Always. The lights dimmed even more. The coordinates of the star were projected onto a wall. Beneath it was a certificate, carefully framed. Keanu took it in his hands and looked at the words. Isabella Mendoza, in eternal gratitude for the light she gave. He stood quietly for a moment, thinking about Isabella's voice. He remembered her reading him stories when he was sad, the way she hummed lullabies in Spanish while folding laundry, and how she had believed in him when he didn't even believe in himself. You know, Keanu said after a long pause, the first story she ever told me was about stars. She said they were ancient souls watching over us. I didn't believe her at the time. Clara looked at him, wiping a tear from her cheek. And now, she asked. I don't know if I believe their souls, Keanu said. But I know hers deserves to shine like one. Dr. Grant stepped forward. We often talk about how stars are born from dust and gas, he said. But the truth is many stars live quiet lives. They burn steadily, never flaring, never fading. And often those are the ones that last the longest. He turned to Keanu. I think that's what Isabella was. Keanu nodded but didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn fabric rose. It was pink with tiny green thread leaves. The petals were slightly frayed, but it was still in one piece. Isabella had made it for him when he was 10. He had kept it in a book for many years. He placed it at the base of the framed star certificate and whispered, This is where it belongs. Clara rested her head gently on his shoulder. They sat there quietly, with the sound of the telescope adjusting and soft conversations in the hallway. The wind picked up slightly, and Keanu could still see the stars shining brightly in the sky. You know, Clara said after a while, it's strange. I used to think my great-aunt had a simple life. No marriage, no big job, no kids of her own, just years of working for other families. But she had a legacy. Keanu smiled softly. Not many people do, he said. Keanu looked through the telescope one more time. Every time I got a role, every time I walked onto a set, she was there with me. Not literally but inside. That's who she was. Clara stood beside him, looking up at the stars. Do you think she knows? She asked softly. Keanu didn't answer right away. After a moment he said, I think she always did. The sky was still. Above them, Isabella's star shone gently, steady and eternal. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.